First thing I want to say is obviously welcome to everybody who's joined us this morning for our School of Sustainable Food and Farming webinar. My name is Simon Thirlwell. I'm the academic lead for the School of Sustainable Food and Farming here at Harper Adams. And the school is essentially a commercial and academic partnership between Harper Adams, Morrison's, McDonald's and the National Farmers Union. I'm delighted to welcome Tom Bradshaw from obviously the National Farmers Union this morning to talk to us about an introduction to carbon. We are going to record the session today. I know a number of people have contacted me to ask if the session will be recorded. We will be recording the session and it will be available on the school's website from tomorrow. We'd also obviously like to encourage some comments and some questions this morning. So if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make, we do have a chat box function. So if you'd like to post a question into the chat box, that would be brilliant. And we're going to come back to those questions after we've heard from Tom this morning. So I'd briefly like to introduce our speaker this morning, NFU Deputy President Tom Bradshaw. Tom farms in partnership with his wife Emily and his parents in North Essex. Alongside a small owned farm, they run a larger contract farming business growing a range of combinable crops across 950 hectares in North East Essex. The home farm is based around arable production, but has also diversified into equestrian and to renewables. Tom has represented the NFU from local branch chairman through to chair of the National Combinable Crops Board and has also served as vice president from February 2020 to February 2022. So Tom, I'm sure you don't really need much of an introduction, but welcome this morning. And I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the introduction, Simon, and delighted that I can join you all this morning. I think the idea of today's presentation is that we try and keep things at a reasonably high level because the inevitable thing with carbon and carbon auditing and the complexity of the carbon cycle is that you very easily end up in the weeds rather than keeping it at a pretty high level. But today really is about the introduction to carbon itself. So we're going to look at why carbon's important, some of the climate change targets, the part that agriculture plays as part of the solution, sequestration and storage, cutting cost and carbon, carbon calculators, scope 1, 2 and 3 emissions, and this is a huge area of detail, but also considerable concern for the industry, but it's something that we're going to have to get our heads around how we deal with. And then finally, carbon markets. And many of you will have heard our President Minette Batters talk about carbon markets as shark-infested waters. And so that's quite an interesting topic in itself. Now, the UK has actually got a really good story around what we've been doing around UK greenhouse gas emissions, in that we have been reducing our emissions over the past 30 years. And you can see that on the graph in front of you. But we've still got a lot more to be done. And what you see there is the blue part is the carbon dioxide. The green part is methane, which we'll probably talk about in a little bit more detail, but it's quite important, particularly when we think about ruminants and how we calculate and attribute for methane, and then also nitrous oxide. So they're the main parts as we look through that graph. Carbon dioxide makes up the vast majority of greenhouse gas emissions, and it stays in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. Carbon itself is often used as a catch-all term, but when we talk about carbon, we're really talking about carbon dioxide equivalent emissions. So when you think about something like methane, which is a short-lived greenhouse gas, it's very polluting, but it's only in the atmosphere for a short amount of time, and it is part of the cycle, whereas carbon dioxide is much longer lived and it's there for hundreds of years. The effects of climate change are being felt by us all right now, and everyone knows the summer weather that we've had this year, probably the driest year for 50 years, and it's really had large impacts right the way across the country. Reservoirs are at historically low levels, and while we have had quite a dramatic amount of rainfall over the past 2 months, we're going to need significantly above average rainfall right the way through the winter to stand any charge of replenishing those reservoirs and the vital aqueducts that a lot of our water supply comes from. And this is creating great concern for our abstractors and how they fill their reservoirs moving forward, as well as for availability of water for domestic consumption. And we've also got to be careful that we do take into account our impacts overseas. So one of the easiest ways for me to get to net zero is to stop producing food on my farm. But if I'd be negative carbon, I'd have carbon that I can trade immediately. But then we're going to be importing that food from other parts of the world. And it's critically important that we don't simply offset those emissions to other parts of the world that we have little or no control over. And I think in the longer term, some sort of carbon border adjustment mechanism is going to be pretty vital when we look at how we really can get on top of climate change for the future. The climate change targets, which were set as part of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, what's known as the Paris Agreement, are supposedly legally binding, with the aim to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, but the legal or the legal commitment to keep it below 2 degrees. But a legal commitment can only be delivered if the global communities coalesce around a simple target. And I guess we've seen COP26 and COP27 very recently. And you do question whether there really is enough action being taken to deliver those global targets. Many believe we've already missed the 1.5 degrees. And I don't think we can underestimate the impact that this is going to have globally. We look at the famines in Africa at the moment, and clearly that's been made worse by the critical situation in the Ukraine. But these countries are really facing a cliff edge in terms of the ability to produce, and climate change is a significant part of that. The UK government has committed to its 2050 net zero target. So while we have the NFU net zero ambition of 2040, this was matched later in 2019 by the government's legally binding commitment by 2050. So that's something that they have to deliver. The legislation is there in place. And I guess my concern is that the easiest actions are those that you take first. And at the moment, we're really not seeing the start of the delivery program. And in government's own 2050 net zero ambition, it highlights elms as being a crucial part of delivering net zero for the country. But at the moment, I would say elms is generally devoid of net zero, and there really isn't a simple net zero ambition within elms that every farm business can be part of. And that's something that we really are looking for government to try and deliver. It is an incentive for every farm business to undertake a carbon audit and start understanding what their footprint is. Since April 22, there's been mandatory reporting for businesses with over £500 million turnover or more than 500 employees. And while the NFU don't fall into that category, we have actually decided to report our carbon emissions as well, just because we feel it's something that we should be doing as a responsible organisation. And you'll see that many major supermarkets and large food service companies will fit into that 500 million turnover or 500 employees. So they all have to report their net zero or their mandatory reporting. And obviously I've mentioned there the NFU net zero pledge or ambition for 2040. I mean, this has opened so many doors within government. It's providing farmers or putting forward farmers as the solution rather than the problem. And I think that's crucially important as we move forward, that farming and farmers are seen as being a part of the solution. And it critically gives us a seat at the table. Now, obviously, you'll all know the carbon cycle and the role that agriculture plays, but we are really uniquely placed as the farming industry, in that while we are a source of carbon emissions, we're also a sink for carbon. And so that does give us a critical role to play in the carbon cycle and in the long-term storage of carbon. We can reduce our greenhouse gas emissions. And I always say to members when I'm talking about net zero, let's divide it into two. And one is the production side of our businesses, where actually anything that we drive efficiency, reduce our carbon footprint, generally it will improve our bottom line, but it will also reduce those carbon emissions associated with the production. And that's a crucial element of it. And the second part is the carbon sequestration side of it, which is a little bit more complicated, but longer term, we have to look at how we can store that carbon. Really, we need to be looking at long-term carbon storage as how we remove the carbon impacts on the climate. And I think when you look at accounting terms, this is generally thought of as being for 80 years plus. So it really is the very long-term carbon storage elements that we are looking at there. And our 2040 ambition is not expecting every farm business to get to net zero, because we know that simply won't be possible, but it is a belief that agriculture as a whole can arrive at net zero. So there will be businesses that are carbon neutral, there'll be businesses that are sequestering carbon, and there will be businesses that continue to emit carbon. But I guess our aim and my belief is that as an industry, we have to aim to be the best in the world. Our ambition has to be that we as UK farmers will have the lowest carbon footprint, whether that be for our wheat production. We know that our beef production is less than 50% of the global average. Our dairy production would be very similar, but we must have that ambition to be genuine world leaders with the lowest environmental impact for our production, and carbon will be a crucial part of that. There may be things that we just simply cannot produce in this country because others can do it more efficiently. And if that's the case, then we have to look into that and think, well, what is it that we can do and really lead the world in? Carbon sequestration and storage. In carbon accounting, carbon storage needs to be additional and permanent, and not thinking about offsetting. I'm incredibly critical of the offsetting side of things. I mean, if there really is no net improvement in the lowering the global carbon dioxide situation, then we shouldn't be able to trade that carbon. And yet many businesses at the moment are buying carbon offsets, and there is no net improvement. There is no reduction in climate change if that's what we focus on. So I think it's absolutely fundamental that we do look at that long-term sequestration, the additionality and the permanence of that storage. Otherwise, it's just a normal part of the carbon cycle. And you don't count the CO2 sequestered in annual crops because that as part of the cycle that's sequestered and then it's released. And so you can't start looking at that as carbon removal. And it's critically important that we do protect existing carbon reserves. And you'll have heard a lot about peatland restoration. I mean, there is a lot of carbon stored in our peatlands, and we do have to think about how we can maintain that carbon within those peatlands. And similarly, if you look at grasslands have a lot of carbon, a lot of organic matter in those soils, particularly the permanent pastures. There must be an incentive for maintaining that carbon storage within those grasslands. Particularly when you compare permanent pasture alongside arable land, the permanent pasture generally has a lot higher level of organic matter contained within it, and recognizing that there needs to be an incentive to maintain that carbon within those soils, I think is crucially important. When we look at the NFU net zero ambition, we divide it into 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is about resource use efficiency. This is about the productive efficiency, driving efficiency within your businesses. And at this time of hugely escalating costs, inflation running at over 31% by DEFRA's figures, which were released last week for the past 12 months, anything we can do that improves that efficiency will have a double benefit of reducing your carbon footprint, but also should be helping make your business more profitable. And profitability has to be at the heart of this, because you won't be able to run a sustainable business unless it's profitable. So we shouldn't be embarrassed about talking about running profitable farming businesses that can deliver on our food production and our environmental and climate change targets. The second sector is carbon storage, or second pillar. And there's a variety of ways to remove carbon from the atmosphere and store it in vegetation. One of the things we often talk about is increasing the size of our hedgerows and doubling the carbon storage capacity of our hedgerows. But there is a case of planting the right tree in the right place. This isn't about wide-scale rewilding, but there will be parts of farmland that are less productive and where there may be the opportunity to plant woodland, but also managing woodland that already exists on farm that may not have been properly managed will help sequester that carbon. And then finally, there's the renewables and the bioeconomy. And actually, renewables is incredibly topical, particularly if you've been listening to any of the headlines this morning. There seems to be a bit of a debate taking place within government around whether the onshore wind ban should continue or whether we should allow wind turbines to be built. We believe that renewable energy is an absolutely crucial part of the solution, particularly rooftop solar, coupled with small-scale wind is something that farmers can deliver and is an integral part of your business. It could nearly take the farm off grid if it was coupled with battery storage. Growing bioenergy crops for carbon removal is another area of this. And I guess if we look at bioethanol, bioethanol has a lower impact on the environment than fossil fuels do. And at the moment, that it's the lowest environmental cost. So while it's not the long-term solution, it is a crucial part of the transition. We also need to think about the circular economy and making sure that a lot of the waste that isn't currently being recycled, and I'm particularly thinking about human waste at this point, can be recycled and used as a soil additive to help with lower fertilizer requirements and make us more efficient. Anaerobic digestion will also be part of that, alongside supplying bio-based materials into construction. And with this woodland that is being planted, it has to go into long-term storage. So it needs to be building materials so that the carbon contained within that woodland does go into long-term storage. If it was simply used for wood chip, then there is no long-term storage, and it will be go back into the carbon cycle, and it won't be removed for the long term. Now, with greenhouse gas calculators, there really is a bit of a minefield. I think there's something like 67 different calculators out there at the moment. Now, we could use that as an excuse for not carrying out a carbon audit, but I would encourage every farm business to start understanding your baseline. We always say that if you're not measuring it, then you're not managing it. And I think carbon is a classic example of that, that if you don't know what your organic matters are historically, then you're probably not measuring it, you're probably not really managing it and thinking about it. So I would encourage every farm business to take place in a carbon audit, but we would, as I said earlier, like this to be incentivized via the SFI, as they are in Scotland and Northern Ireland, and they're paying farm businesses to take place. As long as you use the same carbon calculator every year, then you will get a trend as to what's happening within your business and whether your footprint is reducing or not. And then you can start to set targets and monitor progress. It helps you build a picture of exactly what's happening. And I used 3 different carbon calculators on my farm when I was the Crops Board chairman, to look at the strengths and weaknesses of different calculators. And while they were all variable in what they showed me, they all highlighted that for my arable business, it was my bought-in fertilizer that had the largest carbon footprint and the largest impact on my business. So anything we can do to utilize fertilizer more efficiently will help us reducing our business's carbon footprint. And I mean, that's also true of fuel as well within the farm business. And I always think that extra tractor hours are probably extra carbon footprint. You really do have to drive productivity and make sure that we're utilizing everything as efficiently as possible. But the only counter to that is that the crops I grow with the highest carbon footprint will generally be my poorest performing crops, my lowest yielding crops. And so actually output is a crucial part of lowering the carbon footprint as well. And this is where sustainable intensification is probably a crucial part of the story. It's about using our land mass in as sustainable way as possible, producing the food that we need for this country. But actually with something like beef production, where we genuinely are world leaders with the carbon footprint of beef production, it's about exporting our beef production to other parts of the world that are less efficient than ourselves, so that even if the diet does change, we don't necessarily produce less beef here. We might just consume less beef within this country. Then moving on to Scope 3 emissions in the supply chain. We held a workshop on Scope 3 emissions a few weeks ago now within the NFU to try and get a greater understanding of how we can make sure that farmers can capture some of the value within the supply chain from emissions. There is a general misunderstanding that by providing the carbon data to your processor or packer or retailer, that you hand over the ownership of that carbon. That's simply not true. Scope 3 emissions is about accounting for the whole carbon footprint of the product that's on the shelf. So everything downstream from the bag of flour or the steak that's on the retail shelf, all the emissions associated with that have to go into the emissions. So you've got your Scope 1 emissions, which are the direct emissions that a big business generates. The example there is methane from cows. You've got your indirect emissions, which are those that business generates from its purchased energy, and then all other indirect emissions that occur upstream or downstream in a business. And the classic there is the footprint associated with fertilizer manufacturing, because if there wasn't a demand for that fertilizer within the growing of crops or grassland, then ultimately the fertilizer wouldn't be manufactured. And so we are going to have to report on those Scope 3 emissions, but I fully accept that at the moment, a lot of businesses aren't in a position where they understand their own carbon footprint, so they can't provide that information upstream to the supply chain. And that's going to be a great challenge, and one that even the retail sector recognize the scale of that challenge and considering how they can help us with that conversation. And I think if we did have mandatory, or if we did have the ability to take part in a carbon audit through the SFI, then it could help answer some of the challenges around Scope 3 emissions. When we look at tracking emissions along the supply chain, we've got our Scope 1 emissions, which are the direct, and I guess this is really just a diagrammatic representation of what we were talking about on the previous slide. You've got Scope 1, Scope 2, which are your purchased electricity and heat, and then Scope 3 are the upstream and downstream emissions. Then moving on to carbon offsetting. Carbon offsetting really is the process by which somebody pays somebody else to take actions on their behalf that reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. And the crucial part is that it does reduce the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, because at the moment, a lot of this is about greenwash rather than about a general contribution to reducing the carbon within the atmosphere. And I guess we're slightly concerned here about what compliance looks like, what the regulatory regime around carbon trading looks like, to make sure that businesses are compliant and there really is a fully transparent carbon offsetting market. I've always said that on my farm, I won't trade carbon until I believe I've got a fully auditable system, because if somebody's buying my carbon, they would have every right to turn up one day and say, well, in 2022, you sold me X tons of carbon from your farm. Where is that carbon today? So I believe that we have to have a fully auditable system, and there probably is a role for government within that in setting some of the framework around what that trading could and should look like. And obviously the variability within greenhouse gas emissions at a farm level from year to year, depending on your yield, on your productivity, it means that it's quite a variable picture at a farm level. Then there is the voluntary offsetting market, which is expected to grow hugely by 2030. Net zero commitments by corporates are driving the increase. The offsetting is widely accepted, and that to me is the greenwash part, rather than there being a general reduction in the amount of carbon at a farm level. And it should only be deemed acceptable if the buyer has a holistic net zero strategy. So if somebody is buying carbon offsets in this voluntary market, what actions are they taking within their business to make sure that they are minimizing their carbon footprint? And a few weeks ago, I was on a panel with the chief executive of Cranswick, and the question came up around Scope 3 emissions. And I said, in my view is, you've already talked about the wind turbines that are right next door to your major production facility at Eye. If you're buying the electricity from those wind turbines to demonstrate that you're doing everything you can within your Scope 2 emissions, then at that point it's probably quite right to start thinking about what you do with your Scope 3 emissions. But if you haven't got a strategy within your own business, then it's very difficult to think about how you use this voluntary offsetting market. When we look at the characteristics of high quality offsets, we need to make sure that the offsets need to be able to enable actions that would otherwise have been uneconomic, or would otherwise have been economically unviable, and which really do result in that additional carbon being removed from the atmosphere. So you can't sell offsets from existing trees or hedgerows unless you expand them and increase the amount of carbon that's being sequestered. That does mean that new woodland, which clearly is taking extra carbon out of the atmosphere, but is genuinely incentivized in a way that existing woodland isn't. Whereas if that existing woodland were removed, then there would be an implication for the global carbon. So there's a bit of a challenge there that we have within agriculture. We have to look at the permanence to make sure that we are taking that atmosphere out for the long term, and that it's verifiable, that there really is a way of monitoring and measuring, reporting, and verifying the methodology of that carbon capture. But there are many uncertainties and risks that remain. You've got at the commercial level, retailers and food processors are increasingly committing to supply chain emissions targets, so reducing our footprint in production. And at the moment, that feels like it could be being done to the industry rather than with the industry. And as farmers, we want to be at the heart of this sustainability journey. We don't want to feel that it's being done to us by retailers. There's significant uncertainty, price uncertainty around the long-term obligations, which makes entering into some of these commercial commitments challenging. Policy level, I've already highlighted ELMS and the lack of offsetting or of incentivization within there. But then we're also looking within ELMS for the ability for private investment to co-fund public investment with revenue stacking within ELMS. And that's something that they accept they need to deliver, but it's very easy to say that, but maybe more difficult to actually deliver it. Future legislation could mandate farmers to reduce our own carbon footprint, which could reduce our ability to sell any offsets. And then we've got the science around net zero and carbon reduction. There's concerns around the permanence. There's the issues around methane because it's a short-lived greenhouse gas. So in the short term, it appears to have a very high impact on global warming. But because of its circular nature, if we looked at something like GWP star or dual accounting, then the way methane is accounted for probably has a different impact on particularly our ruminant sector. Agriculture and farming can play multiple roles. I really believe that us as farmers having access to the land, improving our organic matter levels, our hedgerow management, there's lots that we can do. Improving efficiency within our livestock production, our feed conversion ratios, our age at slaughter, genetics, they can all play a crucial role. And I think it's a really exciting time to be involved with farming, and we must see ourselves as providing the solution rather than being the problem. Critically, we need government to look at us as providing the solution rather than being the problem. And I guess the role of us within the NFU and the Sustainable School of Food and Farming is to make sure that policymakers really understand the role that farming and farmers can play. This table just highlights some of the different actions that can be taken, and the slides can be shared after the presentation, so I'm not going to go through it in any detail because I think that we probably want to get to a point now where we open up for any questions. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen now. I hope you've all heard all of that. And Simon, I guess it's back over to you.
Tom, thank you very much for that. That was incredibly interesting and covered actually a lot of area that I think many of us would probably have been thinking about prior to hearing it this morning. Certainly around the challenge of elms and incentives for farmers to start thinking about net zero within elms. I think that's a question that's been on a lot of farmers' minds. But thank you very much.